Okay, so we go to our next topic, which is 1.3 in your book. It's called complex numbers. We've talked about how we're going to have to do this eventually. Let me remind you of what that was about. So, first, the title. The title is Complex Numbers. Okay, now, this is what we have seen in the past. Let me put it over here on the side because that's not the main event yet. We had something like this. I put the square root of negative 16. And we talked about how are you going to get the square root of that? If you do 4, if you say it's 4, well, 4 times 4 is equal to 16. So that's not it. If you say it's negative 4, well, negative 4 times negative 4 is equal to positive 16 again. So that's not it, right? So there was a problem of getting the square root. So they came up with an idea of complex numbers, which I have to explain. Now we'll start the real deal for the moment. Let me call it problem number 1. Let's take the square root of negative 1. We're going to do the exact same thing I did over there, but that just is to remind you of something from the past. The square root of negative 1. Let's start at the real basics, the square root of negative 1. All right, so it can't be 1. What is it equal to? It can't be equal to 1 because, well, let me reserve this for scrap over here. Because 1 times 1 is equal to 1, not negative 1. It can't be equal to negative 1 because negative 1 times negative 1 is equal to 1 and not negative 1. So they came up with just calling it plain I. The square root of negative 1 is equal to I. We just have to accept that. Square root of negative 1 is equal to I. That's what they came up and said. Okay, then there's something called I squared. There's 4 things you have to remember. 4 things that you have to remember. What about I squared? Let me show you what I squared should be. I squared is the same thing as, well, this is extended scrap paper. I squared is equal to I times I. What's I? I is the square root of negative 1. And then you multiply that times another square root of negative 1. And what do you get when you get the square root of 513 times the square root of 513? 513. So the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 is negative 1 itself. So I squared is equal to negative 1. All right, what about I cubed? What about I cubed? What about I cubed? So I cubed is equal to, continuing with scrap paper here, I cubed we know is equal to I squared times I. How much is I squared? We already know what I squared is. It's negative 1. So it's negative 1 times I. That's equal to negative I. Here is I cubed is equal to negative I. And the last one you need to remember, there's 4 of them, is I to the 4th. What's I to the 4th? I to the 4th can be broken down into I squared times I squared. 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. I squared we know is equal to negative 1. Another I squared is equal to negative 1. Multiply them together and you get positive 1. So here are the 4 things that we're able to build. I to the 4th is equal to 1. All right, so I'm going to put them up in the right-hand corner, but I'm going to put it the opposite way. You'll mostly see in books the opposite way. I had to build this from scratch, so I did it this way. But let me put it up over here as I is equal to the square root of negative 1. I squared is equal to negative 1 itself. I to the 3rd is equal to negative I. And I to the 4th is equal to 1. Here's our 4 building blocks. They're here and here, but here, let's call that the main event. So let me go to problem number 2. Let me show you 3 problems right next to each other. 3 problems. Here's what they look like. What if I what if you saw on your test paper, or something like this, problem number 2, what if you were asked, what is I to the 48? All right, bear with me. It seems ridiculous, but hold on. There's going to be a simple way of dealing with it. But let me show you 3 problems all in the same time. 4 problems, actually. Problem number 3. what is I to the 23? Problem number 4, what is I to the 50? And problem number 5, what is I to the 45? Okay, now, I to the 48 is equal to 1. Any exponent with an I next to it, right? Any exponent that's divisible by 4, 48 is divisible by 4. You can divide 48 by 4, you'll get 12. So anything that's divisible by 4 is equal to 1. All right, very nice. How do I figure out what about I to the 23? Well, here's how you figure it out. I to the 23 is equal to I to the 20. What's the largest number beneath 23 that's divisible by 4? The answer is 20. So there's two parts to I23. One is the 20, and one is I to the 3. You add those two together, you get back to 23. How much is I to the 20? I know for sure it's 1. So what is I to the 23rd? It's 1 times I to the 3. 1 times I to the 3, we know what I to the 3 is. It's negative I. So the answer to problem number 3 is negative I. Let me repeat that. I to the 23, how do you deal with I to the 23? You break it into two parts. You look for the largest number beneath 23, which is divisible by 4, that's 20. The other part to make up to 23 is 3, 20 and 3. The I to the 20 is guaranteed to be a 1. The leftover 1 times I is I to the 3. So 1 times I to the 3, how much is I to the 3? You got to remember this. It's negative I, and therefore you answer negative I. Let me show you that and start a pattern. Let me show you that again with this problem, the same type of problem. How do you answer what I to the 50 is? Well, you break it into two parts. What is the smallest number the largest number beneath 50 that's divisible by 4? Answer, 48. What's the leftover to get back to 50? 2. Okay, 48, you're guaranteed, if it's divisible by 4, that means it's going to turn into a 1. 1 times I squared is equal to how much? How much is 1 times I squared? Is I squared. How much is I squared? Look it up on our table of 4. It's negative 1. And therefore you have the answer to problem number 4. And finally, what about I to the 45? Break it down into two pieces. I to the 44, because that's the largest number beneath 45, which is divisible by 4, times I itself, right? I to the 1 power. 44 plus 1 is 45. So this is guaranteed to be a 1. That's 1. 1 times I is I. And what do you answer? You answer I for number 45. So the answer to problem number 2 is easy. It's 1. The answer to problem number 3 turns out to be I cubed. And I cubed, if you look it up on the table, is negative I. So that's the answer for problem number 3. Problem number 4 breaks into 2, 48 and 2. So 48 is a 1. 1 times I squared. What's I squared? Look it up. It's negative 1. So the final answer is negative 1. And 45 breaks into 44 and 1. I to the 44 is just plain 1. 1 times I is I. And we have our final answer for all these type of problems. Okay, so that is one part of complex numbers that we need to know about in case you have a question like that on the test. Okay, now we got a little bit of room on this piece of paper, and let me show you a couple more problems. So again, it's not like I have a blackboard here, or a board of any kind. So now I have to try to make the best I can with our paper that we have here. Okay, so let me show you how to deal with the square root of, I'm going to start a new numbering system again. Problem number 1. What do I do with the square root of negative 25? Again, it's got a negative in there, and it's a square root. How in the world am I going to deal with the square root of negative 25? Next question. What about the square root of negative 16? That's an old question. Might as well do it. Next question. How about the square root of negative 12? Sorry. The square root of negative 12. What does that equal? What is this equal to? What is this equal to? What is this equal to? Square root of negative 12. And finally, problem number 4. What is the square root of negative 13? Here's how you do it. Problem number 1. Split it into 2 pieces. Get 25 normal, regular 25, positive 25 on the left-hand side. Why am I allowed to do that? Because if I put negative 1 on the right-hand side, I've got 25 times negative 1 gets back to negative 25. I'm allowed to split this into 2 pieces. All right, what is the square root of 25? 5. What is the square root of negative 1? You no longer have it on the table, but we still have it up here in the middle. You can still see what the square root of negative 1 is. It's the same thing as I. So it's 5i. That is the answer. 5i. It's a strange world. The world of complex numbers is strange, but that is the final answer, 5i. Now you can see easily how to deal with the square root of negative 16. That's a negative here, right? Negative 16. You turn it into 2 pieces. Square root of 16 and square root of negative 1. Square root of 16 is 4. The square root of negative 1 is I. So the answer is 4i. Problem over. How about the square root of negative 12? Okay, split it into the square root of 12 and the square root of negative 1. That's always our first move. Get that negative 1 over there on the right-hand side. Now, what about square root of 12? Can I simplify that? Remember radicals we had to simplify? The answer is yes, I can simplify it. I put the, what are 2 numbers that multiply each other? Get back to 12, but one of them is one of the perfect squares. It's on the list of the 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, all that stuff. Well, split it into 4 and 3. And this will turn into I. But hold on, bear with me. So this is a 4, that's a 3, and and the I is hanging on. What does this turn into? I need the space over here. Let me go this way. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 3 doesn't move. And here is the I over here, but they usually put the I at the right next to the 2 with the normal number, and then the radical is the leftover at the end. So what did we get over here? 12 turned into square root of 4, square root of 3, split it into 2 pieces. Square root of negative 1 turned into I. The square root of 4 turned into 2 square root of 3, the normal number, regular number, normal radical, simplified. Square root of 3, there's an I at the right-hand side. You might see this on the answer sheet, but most likely you'll see this on the answer sheet. 2i square root of 3. What's the square root of 13? Our last one on this page. Square root of negative 13. You split it into the square root of 13 and square root of negative 1. And what do you do? What's the final answer on that one? The final answer on that one is equal to the square root of 13, I, but you put the I at the beginning and you write I square root of 13. That is how to take care of problem number 4. Okay, so we've run out of time. And let me go move on to the next video. We still have more to do with complex numbers. I might repeat number 4 again because you might not be able to see it well.